What if I told you that a single war not only reunited a nation, but also triggered a global power shift that would reshape the entire world order? Welcome back to Economic and Financial History, where today we're diving into one of the most transformative periods in human history. In my channel, where I explain how the world's economic and geopolitical order was formed, I will discuss together the British Empire's beginning to lose its leadership of the global order, the American Civil War, the first industrial war that rebuilt the United States, and the age of new imperialism. In the next episode, I will then explain the dramatic march toward the Great War following this extraordinarily rapid transformation of the world between 1861 and 1899. Let's go back a bit and see how the United States was rebuilt through civil war. The American Civil War. The contradictions in the founding of the United States would drag the country into a terrible civil war exactly 78 years later. The United States had been built on a weak foundation, formed by the great contradiction between the northern states, which had been the center of trade since the 13 colonies period and were rapidly industrializing, and the southern states, which produced king cotton, the most valuable raw material of the 19th century, based on slave labor. During the 78 years when the United States expanded from the Canadian border in the north to the Rio Grande River in the south, from the Atlantic coast in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, the foundation of the country was never solidified. When the 1848 U.S.-Mexico War gave the United States a region as large as Western Europe, civil war had become inevitable. While the states where slavery was legal demanded that slavery be permitted in the new Western states, the federal government in Washington was determined not to allow this. Not allowing slavery in the new Western states meant the erosion of the power of the Southern states where slavery was legal in Congress and their strength in the voter base. With the election of anti-slavery Abraham Lincoln as president in the 1860 presidential election, 7 Southern states, slavery was legal in 15 states at this time, would secede from the United States and establish the Confederate States of America. The federal government would define this action as a rebellion. With later participation of 4 more states, the South was now ready for war against the North, which represented the Union. The war began when the South attacked the federal government's forts, ports, and barracks stationed on its territory. The North possessed 71% of the total population, approximately 32 million people, 92% of total industrial workers, 90% of total industrial output, 86% of total factories, 128,000 factories, and 71% of total railroad length, 31,000 miles. The North also had an overwhelming naval force that could blockade the South's ports, and many more horses and mules to provide land logistics. The North was also superior in the number of soldiers that both powers could draw from their populations. While the North was able to deploy 2.1 million soldiers to the front throughout the Civil War, the South was able to equip 900,000 people. While the North's armies could deploy 1 million soldiers at their peak, the South's number of soldiers could reach 600,000 at its peak. Moreover, 3.5 million of the South's 9 million population were slaves. The South's advantage was having a male population very skilled with weapons and horseback riding, and more talented generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. The North's generals, including Ulysses S. Grant, who would later become U.S. president, consisted of incompetents who gained experience by wasting soldiers. Although among this group of incompetent generals, there was one general who would perhaps be remembered as the greatest land general in all American history, William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the famous March to the Sea operation. Indeed, although the distance between the North's capital, Washington, D.C., and the South's capital, Richmond, Virginia, was 171 kilometers as the crow flies, despite the North's such great economic and military power advantage, Richmond would fall only in the final phase of the struggle that had spread across the entire continent for 4 years. Moreover, despite this disproportionate military and economic imbalance, the South would even dare to launch operations at the beginning of the war that had the potential to capture Washington militarily. The American Civil War is the first example showing how industrialized nations can win long-term wars. The war was also the first industrial war and showed us how trench and siege warfare could last a long time. This war consisted of a total of 10,500 large and small clashes across the continent. It is believed that 2% of the entire population, or 620,000 people, died in this war. This figure can rise to 850,000, according to modern military analysts, while the U.S.'s irreversible losses were 117,000 dead in World War I, 405,000 dead in World War II, 37,000 dead in the Korean War, and 58,000 dead in the Vietnam War. The U.S. Civil War also gave rise to the modern concept of total war. The North's goal was completely to rebuild the United States under a federal union, meaning it was impossible for the parties to agree or establish a peace treaty. The South, however, could be considered to have won the war from its perspective if it could defend its borders, and as late as 1863, Southern armies were able to threaten the North's capital. General Sherman also played a role in the formation of the total war concept. In Sherman's offensive from Atlanta to Savannah, approximately 500 kilometers, this famous Northern general had agricultural fields burned, railroads and telegraph systems destroyed, factories and production centers demolished, and included the destruction of the South's economic infrastructure among the war's objectives. In this sense, Sherman was studied with curiosity by modern military strategists, and the famous strategist Sir Basil Liddell Hart named him the first general of the modern age. Later, the concept of total war would be used against Nazi Germany and Japan in a much more destructive war. The fact that this war was the first industrial war, that the South's ports, stretching 3,350 miles along the coast, were closed by blockade, and that international trade in cotton, the South's and all of the U.S.'s largest export item, was prevented, resulting in the emergence of the first economic war system of the modern age, shows that the American Civil War was one of the turning points of the 19th century. However, the effects of the American Civil War are much more comprehensive than the above developments. Essentially, the North would incredibly increase its existing industrial capacity with the American Civil War, while also increasing industrial production efficiency, expanding the capacity of the railroads that could transport its enormous production to the front, and after 1865, the U.S. would become an enormous industrial power. This development is similar to the inconceivable productivity and efficiency increase of American industry oriented toward war production that occurred between 1941 and 1945. Thus, in 1871, the U.S. would overtake the British Empire in terms of GNP and reach first place, maintaining this leadership to this day. After the war, while the South was a defeated structure governed by military administration, it would rejoin the U.S. as a result of social, economic, and political transformation through a transition period known as the Reconstruction Era between 1865 and 1877. Slavery had been abolished, but discrimination against people of African descent would continue. The Reconstruction Era is also the first example of Americans taking a society and transforming it, designing a state from top to bottom, incorporating these countries into the Western system, and numerous times during the Cold War period in the formation of various states and regimes, and would greatly develop their mastery in this matter. The fact that the U.S. was rebuilt in a sense after the Civil War and took first place in terms of GNP, and that unified Germany was established in 1871, now symbolizes the transformation of the global system into a truly multipolar world. New imperialism. Although new imperialism appears today as a critical term used by leftist political movements, in the 19th century, new imperialism was an openly discussed policy that was considered normal and supported by a wide majority. For example, during this period, England and France had colonial or imperial offices and even ministries within their state systems to control their colonies. Although France became a republic again in 1871, it possessed the world's second-largest colonial, or in another definition, imperial, empire. The American War of Independence in the 18th century and the collapse of the Spanish Empire in Latin America in the 1820s had brought the race for colonization that began with geographical discoveries after the Renaissance to a halt. This is why the race to capture colonies or territories that began again in the 19th century is called new imperialism. The reason for this new and great race was also economic, as with many major events and changes. The American War of Independence and the Latin American Wars of Independence had taught the great powers of the West that the mercantilist economic system could not be sustained, that simply taxing colonies or making price interventions in the colonies' trade with the homeland, simply drawing wealth from these regions to the homeland, was unsustainable. The slave trade, in which human capital was obtained for free, had also ended. The industrial revolutions and modern capitalism put forward by Adam Smith and his successors, along with the 1815 Vienna Order, provided the British Empire with a perfect environment. First, the fact that industrial inventions began first in England and the resulting large industrial capacity offered England tremendous economies of scale and efficiency. While England was selling finished products to non-industrialized nations such as German states and buyers like the US, it had the luxury of obtaining as much raw material as it wanted from its colonies and buyers at the prices it wanted. However, when Germany unified and the US also embarked on a large-scale industrialization offensive, the chance for England and France to continue their economic superiority depended on their ability to obtain new colonies. Especially the Second Industrial Revolution offered much greater opportunities for productivity and efficiency increases to unified Germany and the United States. More importantly, the first of the three greatest crises of the modern economic system, the others being the Great Depression of 1929 and the global economic crisis of 2008, the Long Depression of 1873, would encourage obtaining new colonies to balance the price drops brought by the emerging overcapacity and surplus supply of industrial products. The most valuable colony of the entire system was India, the jewel of the British Empire. After the 1857 rebellion, this colony was directly attached to the British throne. Just as India provided Britain with enormous amounts of low-priced raw materials produced with cheap labor, these cheap raw materials were converted into industrial products in England, and at the same time, this gigantic country served as a perfect market for industrial products. Control of India was vital for England, and to keep this colony in the system, the British were struggling with the Russians in Central Asia, the Great Game, expanding the Cape Colony at the southern tip of South Africa, and competing with the French over the Suez Canal in Egypt. Now, the race to capture new colonies to protect colonies had begun. The 1857 to 1858 Indian Rebellion had already created tremendous fear in the British. The cause of the rebellion was not the sparks of nationalism spread by the French Revolution. These sparks would come to India 80 years later. The real reason for this great rebellion was the paper cartridges distributed to local Indian soldiers used to fire Lee Enfield muzzle-loading rifles. These paper cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, and for a soldier to use the rifle, he had to bite this paper cartridge with his mouth and use the gunpowder inside. Indian soldiers' beliefs were based on Hindu and Islamic teachings, and cattle are sacred to Hindus. Killing cattle to obtain this fat was unacceptable to Hindu soldiers. For Muslim soldiers, biting a cartridge containing pork fat was similarly unacceptable. This great rebellion that shook the British Empire
the world's only superpower, to its foundations, had occurred because of the fat applied to paper cartridges. But the real reason was the mentality that looked down upon and scorned the lives and beliefs of people in the colonies. By 1871, only 10% of Africa was in the hands of Western powers, while the French in Europe turned their eyes to Africa after the tremendous defeat they suffered against Prussia in 1871. The British officially occupied Egypt in 1882 and began to expand the Cape Colony in the far south. While newly unified Germany was grabbing new colonies in South Africa, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck secretly began to fuel French-British colonial rivalry. Even Belgium, established in 1830, had claimed the Congo, 67 times its size. These lands were initially designated as the direct property of the royal family and established the most ruthless, most brutal colonial administration in history there. Between 1871 and 1914, all of Africa, except Ethiopia and Liberia, had fallen to European hands. In the Far East, Western powers had captured the entire region except China and Japan. The French in the 1880s annexed the present-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia region as French Indochina, while the Dutch gradually captured present-day Indonesia, the Dutch Indies, through a struggle lasting 2 centuries. The rich resources of this region, known as the Dutch Indies, would provide the Netherlands with tremendous wealth. The two ancient empires that Western powers could not completely eliminate, the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire, shared a similar economic fate in the 19th century. With the economic capitulations imposed on both empires and the privileges granted to foreigners, the economic collapse of both empires became inevitable. The analogy "sick man of Europe" that Russian Tsar Nicholas I used for the Ottoman Empire in 1853 later became the basis for the analogy "sick man of Asia" for China. But China's situation was different from the Ottomans. The British had been trying to sell opium grown in Bengal to China as a commercial good. The reason for this was simple. China's exports of products like porcelain, silk, and tea were quite valuable, and the British did not prefer to run such a large trade deficit against China for a long time and at this scale, so they insisted on selling this drug. When the Chinese administration banned the sale of opium, the British would declare war. British gunboats and soldiers would easily win the First Opium War, 1839 to 1860, and the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, effectively taking control of China's ports. Thus, millions of Chinese would become victims of this terrible trade. The reason for the very harsh penalties given to drug smuggling in the Far East today, in some countries the penalty for this crime is the death penalty, is based on the Opium Wars. China's weakness would increase with the concessions given to England, France, Germany, Russia, US, and later Japan over a century. Terrible civil wars had already dried up this ancient empire from within. For example, the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1871, the bloodiest civil war in human history, lasted exactly 21 years and cost 30 million lives. By the time the 20th century arrived, China had ceased to be a sovereign power. Finally, in 1899, with the Boxer Rebellion, the combined forces of US, Russia, England, France, Austria, Germany, and Italy would capture the capital, Beijing, and dictate their terms to the empress. Unlike the slow but tremendous struggle of the Ottoman Empire's collapse period between the 17th and 20th centuries, China had collapsed like a sandcastle in just 60 years. From these ruins, a dynamic state would emerge under Sun Yat-sen's leadership, but this state would also endure enormous suffering until 1945, struggling with Japan, the region's new but merciless power with whom the Westerners could not measure up in cruelty. The Chinese government and people would never forget the century of humiliation between 1839 and 1945. To understand China and the Taiwan issue today, it is necessary to understand this period well. From the smoking battlefields of the American Civil War to the scramble for Africa, From the Opium Wars to the fall of ancient empires, this period set the stage for the conflicts that would define the 20th century. In our next episode, we'll explore how these tensions exploded into the Great War. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which empire's story you'd like to hear more about. See you in the next one.